Hello, I'm Sean Finnegan, and you are listening to Restitutio, a podcast to get you thinking about biblical and historical Christianity, to inspire you to follow Christ, and to convict you to lead a consecrated life. Interview 3, A Letter to a Trinitarian. Today we've got a great show for you. Hugh Knowlton joins me to talk about how we should handle important doctrinal differences with other Christians. Hugh is a veteran Christian of 4 decades who is involved in the leadership of a group of Christians who meet in his home that recently left a traditional brick-and-mortar church. A couple of the other leaders who hold to the doctrine of the Trinity recently discovered that Hugh was a biblical Unitarian. That is, someone who believes the Father of Jesus is the only true God. When Hugh received a letter challenging his beliefs, he decided to hit the books and provide a response to each of these 5 questions. 1. Based on John 1:1, do you believe that Jesus is eternal? 2. Do you believe that Jesus is the Creator? 3. Does Isaiah 9:6 refer to Jesus when it calls him God and eternal? 4. Why does Jesus receive worship if he is not God? And 5. If you do not believe that Jesus is God, who is he? So often discussions like this generate more heat than light. Does that mean we should all just ignore our differences, forcing smiles and hoping that no one peers beneath our thin veneer of unity? Or should we charge headlong like a bull at the matador, eager to present our case and defeat all objections, whatever the cost? This interview will help you strike the balance between empathy and courage as Hugh shows how he stood up for his monotheistic beliefs in a gracious way that refused to forsake kindness while disagreeing on a core issue. Here now is our discussion. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Restitutio. Today I'm here with Hugh Knowlton, and we're talking about answering Trinitarian objections. Welcome, Hugh.
Well, it's good to be here. Thank you, Sean.
To get started, if you don't mind, could you just tell a little bit about yourself and your faith journey up to this point?
We've been very blessed, Susie and I, to have 3 believing children who have spouses who believe God, and we're thrilled with that, of course. And we live in North New Jersey, where we currently fellowship with a lot of Trinitarian believers, wonderful people. We decided a few years ago to attend a local church when our son John and his wife Grace and kids decided to move in with us and stay with us. We decided, well, we should find a place to worship. And we found this church of people who were just very welcoming and loving. We continued fellowshipping there for a few years. And, it was interesting because immediately upon coming on a regular basis, they asked us to be a part of the missionary team, Susie and I. So we decided that we would take a look at it, and we decided to participate. After a few months of going to monthly meetings, they said, oh, by the way, you have to become a member if you're going to be part of the missionary team. So we went to their 2-hour little short course on the history of the church and what they believe. It was actually very well done, very well put together. But of course, we anticipated that they would have a list of things that you would have to agree to believe in and then have to sign on the dotted line. So Susan and I couldn't do that for a number of reasons. Of course, the most obvious is that we didn't believe everything that they do, especially in regards to God, the Father, and His Son, Jesus.
So did they have a statement there that said, I believe in the Trinity?
Yeah, that God is in 3 persons and the whole...
You had to agree to that,
right,
as part of the membership process.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's
typical,
to be expected.
Right. And I can understand why. And then we didn't become members, and then when we were kind of called on the carpet, I decided to go and see the pastor, and I said, Chet, our history, we're from a non-traditional Christian background, and we have non-traditional Christian beliefs. I felt that was the easiest, most honest, least offensive way of expressing our background. I didn't say non-Trinitarian. I didn't bring that word up. But I was never asked, well, what are some of my non-traditional beliefs? Or was I asked about my background? I explained that because of our past and associations with ministries who demanded allegiances, we just felt that that wasn't something we could do. I could have said, well, if you can show me in the scriptures where it's written, I would do it. But of course, I didn't even go that far. He said, well, I'll go to the elders. And I don't know whether he ever did, but no one ever said. I just said, listen, we want to serve. We want to love God's people. We want to serve, give glory to God and Jesus, and serve his people. So they let us continue to serve. So that worked out that way. And
now,
then,
how long ago was that when that conversation happened? A couple of years ago?
Yeah, at least 2 or plus years.
And then some rumblings started happening at the church on other issues related to healing and
well, it's interesting because these are people just like from people who love God, who are seeking. There's those people who are really seeking and want to see God work in a more dynamic way. People who really believe that God is a promise keeper and want to see God, want to see that God is more than just religion. There are those people who are good people who just want to come, be told what to believe, want to serve and do good works. And I'm not saying that in a negative way, but their hunger level isn't to the point where they really want to go further than that, which caused division.
So you're saying that one set of people in the congregation wanted to see God in a more active role, and another segment was content with the status quo and
following the traditions.
Right.
Yes.
So then what happened?
Well, a lot of this centered around a very popular pastor, Bill Johnson, who has a number of different DVD classes and books, and someone might look at some of his things and say he's a little bit on the far outside. But, he's somebody who, in a lot of ways, is trying to help people walk in God's power. He has a class similar to what we would say simply the renewed mind, and he has a longer title for it, which I'm not going to attempt to remember what it is. But he had some very good points. But we were just talking before we turned on the mic about how the orthodox view of the Trinity is that Jesus was fully God and fully man. And then more recently, within the last 100 years or two, what is it, the kenosis theory that you mentioned, where when Jesus became a man, he surrendered or gave up his divinity, so he was a man. Well, this is considered heresy by orthodox Trinitarians, and this is basically what happened, because this Bill Johnson is an advocate of this kenosis theory.
Just to be clear, the word kenosis means emptying.
Emptying.
It's just the Greek word for emptying.
Right.
So it's the idea that he emptied himself of his divine nature.
Right. Now, it's interesting because when we first got involved in the church, we had our son, I mentioned, living with us, and he has 3 children. Actually, he had 2 at the time. One, their oldest, Jeremiah, special needs child who was born with a cleft palate, cleft lip, and other developmental issues. We sought prayer in the church, and the elders there were some elders who were very willing to come over, anoint him with oil, and pray. And these are people who believe that it's God's will for healing. A lot of people in this church may mentally assent to that, or they may actually say, because of the sovereignty of God, it's just not God's will at this time for whatever reason. Yeah, so these elders and the pastor came more than once, and they were great. They were just wonderful. This church has a kind of a revolving policy. You're an elder for a couple of years, and you step down, then you can be voted back as an elder. One of the elders who remained as an elder when this division in the church occurred ended up feeling that he was all by himself, and he decided to leave. And I guess some of the issues were there are people there who are in positions of power and influence that just don't really believe that God works the way he did in the book of Acts, and discourage those that were more, as I would word it, charismatic, which is a popular term. Susie and I gravitated to the people who are more charismatic, those who are more interested in seeing God work.
Right.
Not necessarily does everyone who I'm saying is charismatic speak in tongues. A lot do. But we felt we were in a very interesting position of being able to serve these people, love them, because there's a lot of confusion. People want to know, but they aren't used to being taught, and that's where our background comes in to help. There's ways of teaching people from the Scriptures as to what's available and how to receive it.
So what ended up happening was a division.
Yeah.
And a group ended up leaving the official church.
Right.
And how did you get involved with being in more of a leadership position with them?
Well, it's interesting because at that time, this church had small groups, home fellowships. They called them small groups. Susan and I went to one on a regular basis, and I would go to another one where these previous elders who had ministered to Jeremiah were a part of. And so when this division happened and these people were leaving the church, I just felt compelled to organize a fellowship once a month, open up our home, and we had another wonderful family that had a very accommodating house. We also had fellowships there. We just figured this was a way where we could keep united or keep together, have a monthly home fellowship of a larger size, maybe 20, 30 people. We haven't had as many as 40, but there's enough people that we could have a larger fellowship of maybe 40 or 50 people. So I just networked with people by email, inviting people. It was great because every month we'd get together, worship, sing, praise, give words of encouragement. My good friend George Camella, who's from a very similar background as myself, there's a story I should tell about him because Susie and I invited him and his wife Irene over for a sleepover for a weekend, and we said, "Oh, George, you need to come to church with us on Sunday." So he came, and he was very enthusiastic. And one of the ladies whose house we ended up also having these larger fellowships at saw George and was very thrilled because George wanted to go right up to the front row of the church, and he's standing up praising, and his hands are in the air, and most everybody else is not necessarily as enthusiastic in showing that.
Yeah, George is a very enthusiastic man.
Yeah, and so she comes up to him and asks him where he lives, and it ends up that he lives like the same town, 5 minutes from her daughter and son-in-law, who are believers but struggling. And from there, it took a few months, but George made this connection with this daughter and son-in-law, and we had an impromptu fellowship over at Knowlton's house and Pierre's. And so George got involved, and George is more of an upfront person than I am. So he would be leading these fellowships, but he was trying not to be the kind of leader in the sense where he was doing everything. He was just trying to facilitate. And we have these fellowships. It was mostly praise, singing, worship,
So then since you were still in the closet, so to speak,
right,
ever since you spoke to the pastor, and this group isn't necessarily privy to whatever you said to the pastor.
Yeah.
This group comes from a pretty typical evangelical background,
right,
and yet they're meeting in the house of a Unitarian, a biblical Unitarian.
Right.
How did the conversation come up that you did believe differently as far as who Jesus is?
So what ended up happening was George, at one of our larger fellowships, invited people to come over to Raymond and Anamika Thomas's home fellowship on Sundays. And they're from our background, a biblical Unitarianism. That's what ended up happening, that one believer came over, and I was not there. I just heard what happened, that the guest speaker made a comment about Jesus not being God to some effect, and then so she asked for more information, and she actually was, from my understanding, was quite interested and quite wanted to know more, and someone in the fellowship who had been a Trinitarian minister, who had converted, so to speak, to believing in one God and that Jesus is God, the Father's Son, came up and shared his experiences. So, and she had glowing things to say about the fellowship, as far as the praise and worship and the people that were there, things that were said. But she came home and talked to her husband, and her husband, who was a more adamant Trinitarian, I gather, told her that she couldn't go to that fellowship anymore. Now, the following week...
And this is something you did not go to, so you're not sure exactly what was said.
No, but it's interesting how God works these things out. She did go back the following week. Now, when Raymond has fellowships, he kind of runs them all day. When he starts, they go to lunch, and then some people will leave. They'll have lunch, and they'll kind of continue after. So she kind of knew that, and she came later in the day after lunch to tell Raymond and Anamika that she was not going to be able to attend anymore, which I thought spoke loudly, because I think she probably would have liked to have done that.
Right.
But this one lady who experienced this wasn't part of the church that we had been going to. Was a friend of one of the people who was a part of this church, and so she got back to her friend, and the friend happened to be one of the elders who came to minister to Jeremiah. So there were two elders there that knew of this, and it's great because it wasn't something that was spread abroad. These were two gentlemen who had been almost demonized by the other elders in the church, had gone through a very judgmental process, and who ended up leaving, and they didn't want to do the same to us. So, and these are gentlemen who really have pastors' hearts. So the fellows named Ben and Larry came over, wanted to meet personally with me and George over to our house, and we chatted a little bit.
Specifically on the issue of Jesus' identity?
Yes. As it wasn't like they were coming over to drill us and that they had a list of questions. We shared about our background, shared how we had grown since then to a place where we have elevated the position of Jesus Christ. I think Trinitarians, people who believe Jesus is God, immediately fear that you're just making Jesus a man if you say he's not God. I told them that I've actually learned to disdain the phrase Jesus is not God because it does nothing to explain how there is this connection that Jesus has with deity. Right. I'm not saying he's God, but there's a connection there. And that's a very offensive term. So, I've been very sensitive being amongst Trinitarians not to be offensive. So anyway, the fellowship was profitable, but it didn't end up covering some of the specifics which Ben felt he needed to in an email that he addressed to me afterwards, which asked specific questions.
Yeah, and that's really what I think we want to focus on here on out is these questions he brought up to you and how you decided to answer them.
Right.
One of the reasons why I wanted to have you on for an interview is because of not only the content of what you said in response to Ben's email to you, but also the tone.
Right.
And essentially his email to you was, hey, we need to agree on
right.
Christ's identity if we're going to be co-ministers and working together in this, leading these people. What he does is he lays out 5 main points.
Right.
And
5 questions.
5 questions. And the 5th one is really just, well, if you don't think Jesus is God, then who do you think he is?
Right.
So I don't think we need to worry about that one quite as much. But the other 4 are more standard objections that those of us who do believe that the Father of Jesus is the only true God have to face from time to time. And I thought we could just work through and hear your own response to these a little bit and how you arrived at your response as well, because I know you were doing a lot of research and I'm sure there are some books you'd like to recommend. So let's just start with number 1 here. he writes, John tells us in the opening of his gospel that the Word was in the beginning with God, and the Word was God and became flesh to dwell among us. Do you believe that Jesus is eternal without beginning and without end?
I want to share one thing. I answered the last question first, who I thought Jesus was, because I felt, right away I knew if you say you don't believe Jesus is God, then people are afraid or concerned that you're diminishing Jesus. I put that to rest right away by addressing that. In Ben's email, he expressed a concern about agreeing on his nature, and I said, I don't see a similar concern shared by Jesus, Paul, or John, or the other writers in the New Testament. I'm not saying there isn't a concern, I just don't see a great emphasis on it, other than what I read in Matthew 16, verses 13 through 17, where Jesus asked his disciples, who do you say that I am? And Peter's reply, you are the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And I said, I think this is a great starting point for having common ground.
His question to you is, what is the shared nature,
right,
which is a very non-biblical or extra-biblical kind of question to ask.
Yeah.
As you point out here, this is not the language of Jesus or Paul or John, right, or anyone else in the New Testament. They just don't talk this way.
Right.
And so that should already tip him
right,
off,
right,
although it's kind of a subtle point here, that his whole line of thinking, his whole vein of thinking is itself foreign to the Bible and
right,
being imposed on it.
Right. And, and I just said, I think in simple terms, God uses the simplicity of a father-son relationship to communicate family, intimacy, and similarity, and also distinct differences between himself and who I believe is the Father and his only begotten Son, Jesus. Things that are similar are not necessarily identical.
Right.
And then with the first question of John 1:1.
Hold on, before we get to that, talk to us about the research process you went through to arrive at these answers.
Yeah, that's a good point. Even before this even happened, while I'm going to this church, 2 or 3, 4 years, however long it's been, you hear things that are not true in the Scriptures, especially if you're going to a Trinitarian church. I wasn't satisfied with myself simply to say in my mind, I don't believe that. I said to myself, well, if someone were to ask me, what, Hugh, do you believe, would I be able to articulate a good answer? And I realized that I felt I would fall short in that regard.
Maybe in the past you had good answers that were on the tip of your tongue, but it's been a while since you articulated
right,
specifics to someone in this way.
Well, also, if all you're doing is fellowshipping with people who believe the same thing as you do, there's no need.
Right, that's it.
There is absolutely no need to sharpen your sword. In the year 2016, there is so much available for us who are of the persuasion that there is one God and his Son, Jesus Christ, available to us to work these difficult sections of Scripture compared to what it was 30, 40 years ago. Not that this is a new subject, it's just that, with the age that information is so readily available. I made a habit of building my library up, the help of your website and others. As subjects came up that were being taught in church, I would go to them and read a little bit and say, okay, that's good. But then with this confrontation, so to speak, with this being in front of me, having to respond to specific questions, I realized, okay, I got to really buckle down here and put my nose to the grindstone and come up with answers. Did I want to do this? Absolutely not. I dreaded this.
So it took a lot of work. It was not easy.
But I say I dreaded it because it's massive. It's Christology, the study of Christ. It's a massive subject. And as I said in my letter to Ben, you peel away one layer and you come to another layer below it. You answer a few questions, a whole new set of questions come up. But even though I dreaded it, it was pure love in me, motivated to really help these people understand the truth from the Scriptures. With so many sources of information, the question, the challenge, the dilemma is how do I sift all this down to, where it makes it very simple, palatable, easy to understand, without getting sidetracked, which is easy to do on the subject. So that's where I think God really helped me.
Yeah. Can you call to mind any specific books that you would recommend?
Well, John Schoenheit's book on One Lord, One God. Bob Cardin's book, The One God, The Unfinished Reformation. There's Anthony Buzzard's book. Then there's one that is called The Trinity, True or False, which was really very helpful as well, by Broughton and Southgate. Excellent book. And I'm not including other books. I just don't remember them all. I don't have them in front of me. And that was a difficulty. I had little sticky notes in all these books, and
It's like back in the college days writing a research
Well,
paper.
that's exactly what it was. My wife went away for 24 hours. I had 24 hours to write this, find the information, and synthesize it, reply, and then be done with it.
All right, well, let's get back into the actual meat of this epistle. And the first question is regarding John 1:1. So could you share?
Yeah, well, of course, John 1:1 is probably the favorite verse that Trinitarians want to go to. And every Trinitarian will read Jesus in that verse. The way I put it in my letter, I said, with your first question regarding John 1:1, the question that can be asked is who or what is the Word? The common answer is Jesus. But I said I have a problem with that because I have a problem with that interpretation, that understanding, because I don't see the word Jesus in that verse. It does not explicitly say Jesus. It is commonly supplied by inference. And right away, that's probably the most common thing about the Trinity, is that there's no place in the Bible that explicitly explains the Trinity. It's by inference. They come to the Scriptures already presuming that the Trinity is true, and they read that into the verses.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to make, that the Trinity is this really complicated theological construct that took the finest minds of the 4th century to concoct.
Right.
And really, most people don't understand, even those who believe in it, don't understand what exactly the Trinity is. And it takes more than just saying Jesus is God, the Father is God, the Spirit is God, and there's only one God. I mean, that's the typical way people like to define it, but there is a lot more to it. They're all co-equal, they're all co-eternal, they're all co-essential. God has no parts. Each is fully God, but each is not identified with the other. So the Father is not the Son is not the Spirit is not the Father, but yet they are all God. And then it gets even more complicated than that, because they have the doctrine of eternal generation, which is the idea that the Son is always in the process of coming out of the Father, and he doesn't have a definitive beginning because he's eternal.
Right.
And then the Spirit is somehow proceeding from the Father, or the Father and the Son, and it's not clear exactly what that procession means. And I mean, what I just summarized there, it sounds so foreign to the way the biblical writers talk.
It's mind-boggling. And I'm a simple guy. I'm not like you, who has this in you and it just comes out because you've studied it, you've worked it. I had to put my head into this, and my wife, Susie, is always good at reminding me, just share what the Scriptures say. Just go back to the Scriptures, let the Scriptures speak for itself. And
well, I think that's what you're trying to do here for John 1, because in John 1 it doesn't say the Son. It doesn't say in the beginning was the Son, and the Son was with God, and the Son was God. It does not say that.
It doesn't say it.
What you're doing is you're showing, hey, this is how you're reading it, but this is not what it actually says. What it says is the Word, not the Son, not Jesus, not the second person of the Trinity. That's a simple point. It bumps out the typical vein of thought, the typical groove of thinking that he has about this, and now he's got to look at that and say, I know a little bit of the after story here, but he didn't come back on any of these points that you answered.
Right. I knew what he was going to do, and that's what he did. He brought up other things that we hadn't discussed.
Right. But in a situation like that, you got to look at that as a victory.
Right. Oh,
If he doesn't come back on a point,
right.
It's not like he's going to say, "Oh, well, you got me there." He's just going to bring up more points.
Well, it's interesting because, with that email with these list of questions, I felt, well, now I'm on the defensive. I've got to defend myself. Well, and so when he comes back with his response, I realized that I had gained somewhat of a victory in that sense, because he didn't realize what kind of reply he would get from me when he asked those questions. I only wrote 7 pages in Word. It was like trying not to write a book.
Right. He also did ask you 4 major questions. Then the 5th is, who is Jesus?
Right.
So,
this is not something you can brush aside. People have written volumes, and as I said in the introduction of my letter, that I felt this was a summary of what I believe.
Right. Well, let's move on to the second point. He asks, in the same place we are told that all things were made by him, the Word. Do you believe that Jesus is the Creator?
Yeah. The Logos was the plan of God, because it was his creative self-expression. That whole aspect of Logos not being Jesus, this was something foreign to them. An architect has a plan, and then you see the structure.
Right.
As Anthony Buzzard would say, there's a plan of the St. Louis arches, and then all of a sudden you see the arches. And Jesus Christ was obviously the finished product. As far as whether I believe Jesus Christ was the Creator, I said no and yes. I said there's 2 answers. I don't believe that he was the creator of the original creation, because there are ample verses. And this is, again, a very key point. You have to understand the difficult verses in light of the many, many clear verses. There are many clear verses that show that the Lord God created the heavens and the earth without any mention of the Lord Jesus. So I shared some of those references. Also, as far as whether I believe Jesus is eternal, I said Jesus has a beginning, Matthew. Now, the birth of Jesus Christ was on the rise. That word birth is, I believe, Genesis, which is the same as what's used in Genesis 1:1, beginning. He is the only begotten. The whole subject of preexistence I touched briefly on, as far as God knowing in advance, just like he knows in advance of us one day being here and believing in his word.
So when you said no and yes, you mean no, he's not involved in the Genesis creation, but he is involved in the new creation.
I said God delegated Christ's authority to create. In Ephesians 2:15, it refers to Christ creating one new man, his church, out of Jew and Gentile, and pouring out the gift of Holy Spirit to each believer. The Lord has created something new in each of them. That is, the new man, their new nature. I give scripture references. The church of the body of Christ was a brand new entity created by Christ out of Jew and Gentile. He also had to create the structure and position which would allow it to function, both in the spiritual realm and the physical realm. I mentioned Romans 12 and Ephesians 4. The Bible describes these physical and spiritual realities by the phrase, things in heaven, on earth, visible and invisible, which is in Colossians 1:16.
Yeah, so you really have 2 points of new creation there. You have the new creation in the sense of what he's already brought about.
Right.
But then you also have new creation in the sense of when the kingdom arrives.
I believe the passage that allude to a creative role for Jesus in Colossians 1, verses 15 through 17, and in Hebrews 1:2 refer to the new creation, not the old, and to a new perfect order on earth when Christ returns to rule in the earth and eventually paradise restored. In Colossians 1:15, I think it's important to note that there's a translation that says Christ is the firstborn of all creation. How could he be the firstborn if he existed forever? He's firstborn of all creation. This is where it gets exciting to see about our hope of the future. I said, I believe him to be the author, the firstborn of a new race of men and women, that we will be the second, third, and fourth born. When he returns, we will receive a new body fashioned like his glorious body, which of course is in Philippians 1, verses 20 and 21. He's able to change our vile body that it may be fashioned unto his glorious body, according to the working whereby he is able to even subdue all things unto himself. If that doesn't turn you on, I don't know what does. I mean, I was hiking today, huffing and puffing, feeling pain in my joints, and I realized one day, Christ is coming back. I'm going to have a body like his resurrected body.
Amen. All right, let's move on to the Isaiah question.
Okay.
He says, in Isaiah's prophecy of the Messiah, we read that he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. Isaiah also calls him Emmanuel, God with us. We see both the words God and eternal in this description of the coming Messiah. Does this description refer to Jesus?
Yeah.
This question.
I said there's a lot more than I could share, but time, obviously was a factor. I said this verse, it's important to realize this verse gives 5 attributes of the Son prophesied by Isaiah. I got this from one of the books. I said, I believe it's a basic tenet of the Trinitarian doctrine that Christians should, quote, neither confound the persons nor divide the substance. Athanasian Creed, that's where that comes from. I do not believe that this prophecy of the coming Messiah, Jesus, is equating him to God the Father. I believe the phrase is mistranslated. Everlasting is actually the word age. I believe that Jesus will be called the Father of the coming age. Jesus' Father, eternal salvation. The words everlasting life can be translated life in the age to come. So right away, when we talk about that he is everlasting Father, we're really talking about that he is going to be the Father of the age to come. He's the Father of salvation. Yeah. It's not equating him to God the Father.
Right. Well, you're a father.
Right.
I'm a father.
This is one of his 5 attributes of his sonship.
Yeah. I think of that word eternal as well, that there are 3 different ways to think of that. One is something that doesn't have a beginning, but it does have an end. Another thing that has a beginning but no end. And then a third way to look at it is no beginning and no end.
Right.
Depending on what sort of subject we're talking about. With Jesus, he does have a beginning. With Jesus, we get that from this idea of being begotten,
right?
That he does have a point in time where he comes into existence. We see that in Psalm 2:7 and Hebrews 1:5 and other places as well. And yet he's called eternal here. So that could be a reference to the fact that he's going to live forever. He's already received his eternal life. He's the Father of the age to come, the Father of that eternal age. So I think he can be called Eternal Father in that he is the Father of the faith. We
right.
call Abraham the Father
right.
of the faith. Nobody
right.
gets confused about that. And the Father of salvation, like you said. And he is also eternal
right.
at this point.
Right.
And he's immortal. So I don't think that's as much of a problem. And, the Trinitarian position readily agrees with us on that.
Right.
Because they don't believe that the Son is the Father.
Right.
They believe that they're both God, but they don't believe they're both identical to each other. So I think that is a little easier than the next point you make here about mighty God.
Right.
Because this Isaiah 9:6 is one of the clearest places that does use God language of Jesus. So give us your answer on this one.
I said that the word God in the Hebrew culture had a much wider range of application than it does in our culture. English makes a clear distinction between God with a capital G and God with a small g. But the Hebrew language, which has only capital letters, cannot make a clear distinction. So in the Old Testament, the original word for God, Elohim, is used of God, of course, in numerous places, but also of angels, Psalm 8:5, Psalm 89:6. It's used of rulers, judges, mighty men, Exodus 21:6, Psalm 82, verses 1 through 26. And in John 10:34, I said Jesus quotes Psalm 82:6 in a way that confirms that the reference is to mortal men. It's also Elohim, God. That word is in reference to false gods and idols of the heathen. Exodus 12:12, Exodus 15:11, Exodus 20, verse 3. 1 Kings 11:33. I said in its application to the Messiah is, in my opinion, no proof that it is the second person of the Trinity. A better translation would be mighty hero, divine hero. Both Martin Luther and James Moffat translated the phrase as divine hero in their Bibles. So that was how I answered that question.
Yeah. Another translation might be God's representative or
Right.
God's agent.
Right.
Because I think that's really the truth being
Right.
expressed by
Right.
calling him God. I don't think
Exactly.
it means that he is of the same substance of the Father. I think what it means is that this child represents God, the mighty God, so well that people are calling him by his Father's name. And the other thing to keep in mind is how Hebrew names work in general.
Right.
Take the name Elijah.
Right.
The name Elijah means Eli, which is my God, and Yah, which is Yahweh. So this kid's walking around, and his name is Yah is my God.
Right.
Or you have Eliab, the Father is my God. Frequently, the Hebrews called their children by the name of God,
Right.
or incorporated the name of God into the child's name, and people never got confused about that. So I think it's helpful to make a distinction between naming a child. In Isaiah 9:6, that's exactly what they're doing. They're saying there's going to be a child, he's going to be born, this is going to be his name, and then you get this long string of Hebrew, but we translate it into English so that we understand it. And it's like what we might call a name sentence. You see the same thing in chapter 7 with Emmanuel, and then which was actually a person that lived back in Isaiah's day, Emmanuel. And then it gets applied to Jesus later. And then also in Isaiah 8, you have Meher Shalal Hashbaz, which is a long Hebrew name sentence, which means quick to the plunder, speedy to the prey.
Right.
But, that doesn't mean that kid is going to necessarily become a warrior and pillage people. What it means is that this child signifies that the battle is going to be won. So it's a sign child. You see what I'm saying? So I don't think it's really helpful to take everything so literally when it comes to a child's name.
Right.
Certainly Isaiah 9:6 is unusual because it's the longest one.
Right. Right.
But I don't think we can use it in that way. Furthermore, I just want to add in here that the NET does a great job in their translation or their study note on this verse, where they talk about how ancient people could be called God, especially the king, because he represents God. And they point to other ancient Near Eastern documents that describe their kings in such a way. And also we have Psalm 45, where a son of David, it's not clear whether it's Solomon or some other king, is called God.
Right.
Just straight out
Right.
God. And that's Isaiah 45:6. So this is something that is, for our culture, is totally unusual and unconventional. But for their culture, it was an accepted way of talking about it. As Jesus himself, you point out, Jesus himself does this in John chapter 10 when they question him, do you really think you're God or whatever? And he says, well, doesn't it say that you are gods?
Right.
So
Well, this whole thing about agency is really important to understand, I believe, because it does say that Jesus is the image of God, and if Jesus is the image, it automatically says he's not God, if you really think about it, because the image, if one thing is the image of another, then the image and the original are not the same thing. My heart goes out for Trinitarians. I understand they believe what they've been taught,
right.
but there's an identity confusion there.
Yeah, there's identity confusion, and I think a lot of it is, quite honestly, based on what you've told me about this group, just received tradition.
Yeah.
And here's the problem. We use this tradition word, but in reality, their tradition isn't traditional if you go far enough back.
Right.
So if you look in the New Testament, the Trinitarian tradition is not there yet.
Yeah.
If you look in the 2nd century, it's not there yet.
Right.
You don't find it full-blown until the 4th century, where all these things get worked out
Right.
to the form that people agree with today. In fact, the creed most people quote in churches is not even till the year 381.
Right.
So I know today we would say, well, that's a traditional view, and you were saying, well, I'm non-traditional. I think in a sense you're more traditional than they are.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
All right, so let's move on to point number 4 here. He asked you about revelation and how...
Yeah, it was about worshiping. He felt that if you could worship...
Oh, John falls before the angel.
Yeah, right.
And then the question is, well, can you worship Jesus? Somebody sees Jesus and says, my Lord and my God, and bows before him, referring to Thomas. Why does Jesus receive worship if he is not God? That's really his main question here.
He says he sees worshiping Jesus as a declaration of his divinity. I said I see worshiping Jesus as someone definitely worthy of worship, as Revelation chapter 5, verse 24 declares, saying with a loud voice, "Worthy is the Lamb that was slain to receive power and riches and wisdom and strength and honor and glory and blessing." And then also the Father and the Son are deserving of equal honor. John 5:23, that all men should honor the Son, even as they honor the Father. He that honors not the Son honors not the Father which has sent him.
Your understanding of worship then is that someone can rightfully worship Jesus. That's not idolatry or somehow infringing on the worship of God.
No, I don't think that offends God one bit. No, you're giving worth to someone who gave his life for you and I. I don't have a problem with worshiping Jesus and not believing that he's God, the Father, Yahweh.
Right. I mean, what is worship? It's bowing to someone,
Yeah.
it's praising them or singing songs to them,
Right.
or honoring them in some way. And you think of like your own son.
Right.
If somebody wanted to honor your son,
Yeah.
would that make you feel uncomfortable or jealous? No. It would make
No.
you feel proud as a father.
No.
Unless they were honoring him for something that you did
Right.
and he didn't do.
Right.
And then it's a dishonest situation, or it's confused, or at worst, it's malicious to steal, rob your glory and give it to him,
Right.
whoever's doing this. So I think there is such a thing as improper worship of Jesus. Like if you're worshiping Jesus because he architected the plan for all of creation, well, you just took something away from God and gave it to Jesus that you really shouldn't have.
Right.
Vice versa. If you worship God for dying on the cross, you worship the Father for dying on the cross, that's also wrong.
Right.
You know what I mean? So I think
Right.
there is a wrongful worship of Jesus, but then there is an appropriate worship for Jesus, which we see throughout the New Testament.
Yeah.
People run up and they bow before him and they say, "Sir, can you heal my friend?" or whatever. And then you have it in more of a religious context with the disciples a couple of times where they bow to him. But it's not over against God, because Jesus is not in rebellion to God. It says in Philippians 2:9 that every knee will bow to Jesus and confess him as Lord to the glory of God the Father.
Right.
It's really a good point to get clear.
Even though we could say that Trinitarians are not giving maybe the proper honor to God the Father, I think some of this is just my own opinion. I don't believe God has an ego, and I think Jesus Christ will correct any of that in the future. And I think even today, he being the image of God, if he receives worship, misplaced worship, he reflects it back to the Father. I just don't think that God has a big ego.
Well, that leads us into the last point, which is the tone of this letter. And if anyone wants to read the letter in its entirety, I'll have a link to it on the show notes for today. But the tone of the letter is it's non-combative, and it's at the same time uncompromising. And what I mean by that is you don't just wimp out and say, "Oh, we're all the same thing anyhow," and say, "Let's just hold hands and not talk about it."
Yeah.
I mean, that's a cop-out.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, you don't go for the jugular and say, "Look, you're an idolater.
Yeah.
You're worshiping a three-headed beast,
Right.
and you're all going to hell." You're holding your ground. You give him some things to think about himself, too,
Right.
at a certain point in here. And then you respond rationally and biblically to his points here. How did you arrive at striking the balance on the tone for this?
Well, I think that is prayer. I mean, listen, I told you this was something I dreaded doing. I felt it would take a lot of time. I found myself in a position where my wife helped me say, "Hey, listen, you just got to do this." And I had a 24-hour period, and I said, "Okay, that's it. I'm gonna be by myself. I'm gonna do this." I had been praying about this, prayer of love for these gentlemen, and for God to help me. I just think that the Spirit of God will always come through if you have your heart right. I was just trying to be empathetic and express my love and compassion for them in a way that would not be offensive. These are men who have known me for a few years, so they have seen the fruits in my life, which I was very thankful, number one, that there was time enough for that to happen and that they recognized that.
Yeah, they couldn't just write you off as some wacko
Right.
fringe person because they actually
Right.
knew your character.
A hardcore, more militant Trinitarian would not only cast me aside, not want to deal with me, not want to fellowship with me, he would be so bold as to say, I'm not even saved. Okay, so
Yeah.
this is not the heart of these men. I don't know whether that's the best answer I could come up with as far as how
No,
to
I think that
strike
was
the
great.
balance.
Yeah, that was great.
I do encourage people who might be interested to read the letter because, there's a lot of points I would have liked to have shared, but time does not allow.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of other good stuff in here. And just by way of conclusion, how was this received? Was there a long gap there where you were waiting day after day for a response, or was it pretty quick? And what did he say?
It took a week or so for Ben to get back to us, and to my email was he was very thankful. I think the first word that he wrote was "wow" in all caps, saying, I don't think he expected an answer like what I provided him, but the response that he gave to both of us, as you had mentioned, Sean, he didn't really go back to any of the points that we discussed or I brought up or answered his questions. He brought up two other points, which I was fully aware that he might do that, which his reply basically was, Jesus, the truth was crucified to restore relationship and that we could go back and forth doctrinally. He kind of ended it there. He didn't consider this something that was worthy of stopping our fellowshipping and worshiping together, which I think is wonderful.
Well, I think he also discovered something of your character and the quality of your faith, in the sense that you didn't come back with insults.
Right.
You didn't come back with let's all get along. You came back with a lot of Bible.
Right.
And it seems like that made an impression on him.
Right.
That you are grounded in Scripture. You're
Right.
not some New Age weirdo or a skeptical agnostic, or he couldn't pigeonhole you in one of those positions.
Yeah.
You're a genuine Christian brother who believes differently on the subject of Christology.
Yeah.
And so he brought up these two extra points. I would almost, when you respond to him on that, bring up two of your own points.
Yeah.
Maybe the fact that Jesus is a Jew, and as a Jew, he agreed with other Jews on who God is in Mark chapter 12. Or that he himself says the Father is greater than I.
Right.
Or that he was tempted and the Father can't be tempted with sin.
Oh, yeah.
Or, there's so many different points that you could bring into this, not to overwhelm him, but just to push the conversation a little further.
Yeah.
In the sense that this is not just you on the ropes here,
Right.
but
well, it's an interesting thing because you could easily win the argument
and lose the person.
Right. A man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. They'll still end up believing the Trinity. You could win it, but I was trying to win hearts, and I think I succeeded. But we'll see what happens.
Well, thanks for taking some time here today, and I think this is something that can encourage people and help them out. I think especially because you're not a professionally trained theologian or somebody with all sorts of degrees, that you are, an honest-hearted, Bible-believing Christian who's thought about these things for a long time, and that you did take the opportunity to stand up for what you believe in, but to do it in such a way that express love. I think that is something that I will be able to help and encourage people, because I feel like there's a lot of biblical Unitarians out there who are in the closet in their respective churches, and they don't know what to do.
I got to say, this built me up. This made me more convinced of what I believe. I feel better about doing it, even though I dreaded it. I'm thankful that I did it.
Right. And your perspective, too, is so helpful and refreshing as well, that you're coming from a place of genuine empathy and love for somebody.
Right.
Rather than trying to set them straight, you actually care about these people, and they're, so far as you understand it, they're off on this subject.
Right.
And not just by a little bit. They're way off on this subject. And
Right.
so what does a genuine, loving person do? It's not pat them on the head, but it's to say, hey, take a look at this. Have you thought about it like this before? Because
Right.
they haven't.
Right.
And this at least gives them a shot. And then
Right.
God can work within them and shine his light on it. I mean,
Right.
I can't even tell you how many stories I've heard in my lifetime of people who, just with the Bible, eventually came to see the light because they were open a little bit to it, and
Right.
God worked with that.
Right.
So, I mean, that could all be part of a bigger picture here.
Yeah.
But thanks so much for taking the time today.
You bet, Sean. Thank you for asking me.
Thanks for taking the time to listen today to this interview. I just wanted to read out some comments that we've received on Restitutio. And the first one is by Paul Peterson, who commented on podcast number 47, Resurrection Implications, by Richard Hayes, an excellent lecture that discusses the importance of bodily resurrection, that belief, as well as the implications for practical living that this has. Let me read out his first comment here. He says, I had never seriously thought about, and therefore really appreciated, what Professor Hayes referred to as 4 practices of resurrection, practical ways in which we can live our lives in light of the reality of the future resurrection of our bodies. And then what Paul does is he goes on to list out Professor Hayes' 4 main points, including 1, peacemaking, 2, sharing possessions, 3, reconciliation at one table, and 4, Sabbath keeping. And he pulls out quotes from Hayes' lecture that resonated with him for each of these 4 areas. And if you haven't given it a listen yet, I encourage you to check out episode 47, Resurrection Implications. Believe me, it's not the same old resurrection sermon you've heard a million times. This has got some edge to it, and I think it's worth your time to consider. Thanks, Paul, for pulling out those quotes and including the links to the cartoon Hayes referenced, as well as the song Carousel that he referenced, so that listeners can go on restitutio.org and check out those resources for some follow-up. Also, Brian dropped a comment on off-script episode 12, Forgiveness. This was kind of interesting because Brian was actually there just before we recorded this episode and gave Rose a way to say goodbye in Hebrew. And after having listened to it, Brian made the following comment. He said, some great points and certainly a relevant discussion for all Christians today. Thanks again for the conversation. I love the line, unforgiveness is viral. Please keep these great conversations coming. Also, great pronunciation, Rose. Thanks, Paul and Brian, for taking the time to drop a comment. If you would like to add your voice to any one of these podcast episodes, including today's, please visit restitutio.org, and you can find the episode that you're interested in and go ahead and drop a comment there. And also, if it's not too much trouble, please review us on iTunes. A number of folks have been commenting, and I'm so thankful for that. But the way we can expand our reach and appear higher in searches for podcasts is if we have more reviews in iTunes. So if you don't mind, please jump through the hoops on iTunes to write a review. It really means a lot. It really makes the biggest difference. And this way we can help others to love God, follow Christ, and seek truth wherever it leads. Last of all, if you're listening to this episode online, why not subscribe to this podcast on your phone or your tablet so that it automatically downloads new content when it becomes available? You can do that by visiting restitutio.org, and right on the top, I have a button there, subscribe to podcasts, that explains the 2 different ways to do it, whether you are an Apple user or an Android user. So go ahead and check that out, and remember, the truth my friend, has nothing to fear.